and welcome to session 2 of Online Interdisciplinary Symposium, presented by Doctors for COVID Ethics and hosted by UK Column. I'm your moderator, Taylor Hudak. You've heard from leading medical experts around the world explaining the science of COVID-19 through a medical perspective, and many of the measures taken to prevent the spread of COVID-19 had a profound economic impact. During this session of the conference, you will hear from leading experts in the fields of economics and finance to explain the economic dimension of the developing and ongoing response to COVID-19. Our first speaker to discuss the pandemic as a monetary event is John Titus. John Titus has written, produced, and directed videos about the loss of the rule of law in the United States since 2014. His focus on videos largely reveals Wall Street crime and cronyism in the financial system. He has a Juris Doctor and has litigated patents for 25 years. He also holds bachelor's and master's degrees in electrical engineering and worked as an electrical engineer in the space industry. Since 2020, John has co-produced and co-hosted Money and Markets with Catherine Austin Fitz at Solari Inc. John, I want to welcome you to the stream.
Thank you for having me. And I'm just going to launch right into it because it's 20 minutes. And what has happened during the pandemic is most certainly a monetary event, but you need to have a crash course in certain aspects of the monetary system that are not accessible and are not known certainly by even intelligent lay people or even in a lot of cases by bankers themselves. But what happened? I'm going to give you a preview of the evidence, and then I'm going to get into the evidence itself. But what has happened is that in March of 2020, the Federal Reserve, which is the US central bank, began a course of action that radically broke from a century-old monetary pattern. And the Fed's new course of action at that time was to use its power to create wholesale or public money so as to directly affect the retail or private money supply. Don't worry if you don't understand that right now. I'm going to give you a crash course, as I said, and walk you through it so you can understand and see what is happening during the pandemic at the behest and at the instigation of the Fed, all very deliberate things. But once the pandemic started and once the Fed began adding more and more money, wholesale money to its balance sheet, the Fed added $3 trillion in wholesale money. It basically doubled its balance sheet within the space of a few weeks. And that in turn caused the mirrored image creation of $3 trillion in retail money. And retail money is money that you and I and people watching this symposium use. But as it turns out, the Fed's new course of action that it began back in March of 2020 was pursuant to a plan devised by BlackRock and presented to the Fed and to indeed all central banks around the world in August of 2019. And so this was basically a foreordained response to a crisis. And we'll look at the BlackRock plan and you could see that. But BlackRock advised the Fed to implement its unprecedented plan. And unprecedented is BlackRock's word when the next economic downturn hit. In fact, that's the title of BlackRock's paper, is the next economic downturn. And as fate would have it, that downturn actually began in September of 2019 in New York in what's called the repo market. And it got a lot worse during the pandemic, but it most certainly started in September of 2019. And BlackRock presented this plan at a meeting in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, hosted by the Federal Reserve and attended by all the central banks around the world and all the monetary and financial bigwigs around the world. And BlackRock presented this plan, and it called its plan for creating central bank money and somehow getting the central bank money or public money into private hands. BlackRock called this plan going direct. Now, since the Fed implemented the BlackRock's going direct plan starting in March 2020, it has left a monetary record behind. And when you examine this monetary record, you could see very clearly that the Fed was definitely and without question following BlackRock's going direct plan to the letter. And by way of that background, I now want to go to a clip from a guy named Augustin Carstens. Augustin Carstens is the general manager of the Bank for International Settlements. And he is going to talk basically about central bank digital currencies in a short clip here. It's less than a minute long. And central bank digital currencies is where we are headed. That's sort of the third step. The second step is what I'm largely going to talk about today, but I want you to know where we were heading with all of this and what all of this means. So I'm going to cut to the chase and show you where we end up. And keep in mind, this is from the head of the Bank for International Settlements. The BIS is the central bank of central banks. So all central banks around the world are part of the BIS, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank, so on and so forth. Here is Carson's. Listen to what he says about central bank digital currencies, because this is where we're going.
Now, in all our analysis on CBDC, in particular for the use of general use, we tend to establish the equivalence with cash. And there is a huge difference there. For example, in cash, we don't know, for example, who's using a $100 bill today. We don't know who is using a 1,000 peso bill today. A key difference with the CBDC is that central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability. And also, we will have the technology to enforce that.
Well, there you heard it right from the horse's mouth. Absolute control over the monetary system by central banks. So they're going to be, ultimately, they're trying to control every dollar that you spend and decide whether the purchase you want to make with your electronic money, because they don't like cash, is going to go through or it's not. And that's where we're going. Now, to understand where we are and to understand where we've been, you need to understand something about the monetary system, and it's not well known, as I said. And this is the split circuit monetary system. The split circuit monetary system is in place throughout the world, basically everywhere in the world, except with precious few exceptions. Everybody, every country, every major jurisdiction has a split circuit monetary system. And so to be clear about this, circuit implies electronics, because as you just heard, the central bankers do not like cash. So we are excluding cash from this discussion, and we are focused on electronic bank money or electronic money in general. But that money exists in a split circuit. What do I mean by that? A split circuit, it actually means just what I said. It's two circuits. It's really split in half. One circuit is the private circuit, and one circuit is the public circuit. That's the other circuit. Those are two circuits. The private circuit is the retail circuit, and the public circuit is the wholesale circuit. Private and public, as we are going to see, refers to who is issuing money in the respective circuits. And so let's start with the private circuit, because that's the circuit we use, the retail monetary circuit. Who is in the circuit? As I said, the issuer of money in the private circuit is commercial banks. Commercial banks create money and lend it into existence. So they create money out of thin air when they make loans, and then that money gets circulated among a circuit of central bank money, of commercial bank money users, who ultimately, the lenders, the borrowers pay the money back. Now, for a long time, for basically a century, economists actually argued about whether commercial banks could create money out of thin air. And that debate about whether they could do that was definitively resolved in 2014 in a brilliant paper. And I don't use that term, I use it very sparingly, a brilliant paper by one of the participants here today, Professor Richard Werner, in a 2014 paper called Can Banks Individually Create Money Out of Nothing, in which Werner undoubtedly and beyond a shadow of a doubt proves that commercial banks create money out of nothing. I was so impressed by this paper when I discovered it in 2018 that I made a video about it for my YouTube channel. I called it Mommy, Where Does Money Come From? You are looking right now at a screenshot of that video, and you can see that video on my YouTube channel, Best Evidence. I dumbed that paper down quite a bit to the consternation of the paper's author, as it turned out, based on subsequent emails. But you can review the paper or look at the video and see the commercial banks create money out of thin air. That's beyond dispute now, thanks to Professor Werner. So who is using the commercial bank money circuit? In basic terms, the users of the commercial bank monetary circuit, the retail monetary circuit, are non-bank entities and people like you and me to finish off the circuit with a cheesy gloss there. But that's basically who uses the commercial bank, the retail money circuit. So if you have an account at Bank of America, which I don't, or HSBC or Barclays, that's all commercial bank money. That money is created out of thin air by those banks. And the team color for the private money circuit, the commercial bank money circuit here is green. That's the private circuit. And I chose that color because money in the US at least is green. Now let's look at the public circuit. And this refers to, of course, the fact that the issuer of money in the public circuit, at least in the official version of the story, is a public entity known as the Federal Reserve. The Board of Governors is certainly a public entity. The issuer of money in the Fed is the regional circuits. They're not public, but that's neither here nor there. It's public money. The power to create money in the US is sourced in the Constitution. It is a public right. It's a public good. But the Federal Reserve issues its own money. And the money is in dollars, just like the retail money in the US. But the users of the Federal Reserve money, the wholesale money circuit, are different. They include other central banks like the European Central Bank and the Bank of Japan, and the Bank of England, and Royal Bank of Australia, and so on and so forth. That is one class of users. Another class of users of Federal Reserve, the public money, includes the US government, including, most importantly, the US Treasury. And the third and final class of users of the wholesale monetary circuit are commercial banks. They're shown here in green, but this time they have a rectangle around them because they are not the issuer of money, like the Federal Reserve with a circle around it. They are a user of money. All of these entities in the public money bank circuit, in the wholesale monetary circuit, transact in public money, in the wholesale money. And so that's the public circuit. And when we look at these two circuits, the private circuit and the public circuit, they are both in dollars. Everything is denominated in dollars, but the money is referred to differently. In the private circuit, I'm going to talk about bank money since it issues from banks. And in the public circuit, I'm going to talk about reserves because that is what the Federal Reserve creates out of nothing. It is reserves. But you cannot spend reserves. I can't spend reserves. We do not have accounts at the Fed. We can only transact in bank money. And so let's look at, let's start with bank money and get a feel for how much money we are talking about. I have a graph here I'm going to fill in a minute of bank money in the US since 2003. So it covers almost 20 years. It's in trillions of dollars. It maxes out at 20 trillion. But if you look at the history of bank money in the US, you can see up until the time of the pandemic that it is a very linear process. It increases linearly as banks lend more and more money and create more and more money. The money goes up. So it starts at $5 trillion in 2003, tops out at about $13 trillion in 2013, and then the pandemic hits, and then things change. But we'll get to that in a minute. But that's bank money. I'm also going to talk about, let's take a look at reserves in our system. Reserves are also in trillions of dollars. So the scale of money here is the same, but there isn't as many reserves in the system as there is bank money. Let's just look at reserves in the graph of it. And you can see that it increases, it basically starts at zero and remains at zero until the middle of the financial crisis. By the way, the gray bars, there are two gray bars in this chart. The big gray bar is the global financial crisis of 2008. It lasted for something like 18 months. The skinny gray bar, the Fed tells us, is the recession that was occasioned by the pandemic. Supposedly, it only lasted 2 months. So there you have it. That's the official version. But you can see, looking at the graph of reserves in blue there, the reserves increased massively from basically zero. It wasn't zero. It was $30 to $40 billion. It was 0.03 to 0.04 trillion dollars. It increased massively during the global financial crisis of 2008, because what the Fed was doing was creating trillions of dollars of reserves at that time. And it was using those new reserves to buy assets from commercial banks in the wholesale monetary circuit. And you can see when despite the fact that the Fed started to create and then kept creating more and more reserves beginning in 2008, that blue line really has no effect on the green line. That despite the creation of all these trillions of dollars in reserves, it doesn't really affect the green line at all. It doesn't affect the retail money supply at all. And you can see that when I move the blue line up, even in the middle of the global financial crisis, when the Fed puts the pedal to the metal and starts creating trillions of dollars of reserves, it really has little to no impact on the retail monetary circuit. And I'm going to move it up again so that the lines basically come together at the beginning of the pandemic. But you can see from the green line that that's essentially a linear relationship. It doesn't deviate from the line, the retail money supply. Our money supply does never deviated from the line. And that's really the key takeaway here, because once the pandemic starts and once the Fed gets going to town here, that relationship, which goes on for 100 years, the retail money supply being impervious to changes in reserves, changes overnight. And so let's look at what happens when the pandemic starts and the Fed starts packing trillions more onto its balance sheet. So let's complete the graph of reserves. And there you can see the Fed really ramps up reserves. It adds $3 to $4 trillion of reserves. It's really 3 trillion through the gray bar through the pandemic. That's one hump, and then there's a longer extension there. It's about another $1 trillion. So the Fed's balance sheet is now sitting at over $8 trillion, but $2 trillion of that is cash. So it's sitting at about $6 trillion right now. Now, if the old relationship between reserve money on the one hand and the green central and the green commercial bank money on the other hand were to have obtained, that green line would just keep on trucking it. The line would just go to the very end, but it doesn't. What happens is suddenly the retail money supply begins tracking the central bank money supply. And that is a radical departure from what had happened basically the prior 100 years. I want to zoom into this, and I'm going to have to get my head out of the way so you can see it. There you go. But that is what's going on. And you can see that when the pandemic hits, for every dollar of reserves that the Fed adds to its balance sheet, the retail bank money supply goes up by $1 as well. And that's what's new. That was a radical departure, as I say, from what had happened previously. And that was not an accident. As it turns out, that was pursuant to a plan issued by BlackRock in Jackson Hole, as I mentioned. And the plan by BlackRock is called Dealing with the Next Downturn. So they're expressly contemplating another economic downturn. And they're contemplating it in August of 2019 when this paper came out and when BlackRock presented this paper to the Fed. So the premise of this paper is there's going to be another downturn, and BlackRock is offering the Fed and offering central banks advice on how to deal with the next downturn. And so what's BlackRock's advice? Well, let's go down to the next page. Take a look at the first bullet point there, to cut to the chase. There is not enough monetary policy space to deal with the next downturn. Basically meaning, forget the notion of creating reserves to buy assets from commercial banks. You're going to need to step it up, that reserve. You need to do something else. And so what are they going to do? The current policy space for global central banks is limited and will not be enough to respond to a significant, let alone a dramatic downturn. Okay, so the old way of doing things isn't going to work. You need to do things differently. And what do they say? Look at the fourth bullet point down there. An unprecedented response is needed, says BlackRock. What is that response? Here you go. BlackRock says that response will likely involve going direct. Those are BlackRock's words. That's their plan. They're going to go direct now. What does going direct mean? Going direct means the central bank finding ways to get central bank money, meaning you got to find a way to get that blue line to have an influence on the retail bank money circuit. You have to find a way to get central bank money issued by the Federal Reserve directly into the hands of public and private sector spenders. And that is exactly what we are seeing in this graph right here. And again, I'm going to zoom into that graph and cut my head out of the way. And you can see the public money in blue being matched dollar for dollar in green. And I wrote the paper, The Going Direct Reset, for Catherine and for Solari, and it explains how the Fed did that. But for present purposes, all you need to know that is exactly BlackRock's plan. You just saw it in the BlackRock presentation from August of 2019. they say we need to find a way to get that public blue money into the green money circuit, and there you see it happening. Now, to put some context on this, that is BlackRock's in terms of time. BlackRock's going direct paper was presented on August 22nd of 2019, and they contemplate a next downturn. Notice that when BlackRock presents this plan, a few days later, maybe a couple weeks later, the Fed's that blue line has been declining for a while. It's been declining for about 18 months. Reserves have been declining. Suddenly, they start to tick up quite a bit. And the reason for that is that the crisis that BlackRock expressly contemplated began. And it started in the repo market on September 17th, 2019. The New York Fed comes in and begins adding money begins adding reserves to the repo market. That continues for a few months, and that goes on until the pandemic hits in earnest and the Fed begins really packing money onto its balance sheet. And then, that's what is going on. But make no mistake about it, the Fed here is implementing BlackRock's plan almost to perfection. And so that is really that. And that is really why I say the pandemic is completely a monetary event. It is not really, I don't consider it a scientific event, a health event. It is a monetary event in the transition, ultimately, to get more and more central bank control. Like Carson's was talking about, we want to control all money. What you just saw here with the central bank going direct plan issued by BlackRock, that was an important step. It broke with 100 years of prior monetary history by the Fed and indeed by all central banks. And this is where we are. But the pandemic is a monetary event. And with that, that kind of concludes my presentation.
John, I want to thank you for that presentation.
We all have our opinion, how we ended up here. Kids are led by video games, mama's drunk, most of the year goes on and on and on and on and on. We know it ain't right. It goes on and on and on and on and on, with no end in sight. Make the lock for the register, let the money disappear. Stay like the river, mix it with the blood and tears. Goes on and on and on and on and on. We know it ain't right. It goes on and on and on and on and on. Lost in the wrong fight. Blame it on the immigrants, blame it on the refugees, blame it on the terrorists, blame it all on you and me. If your name's not on the list, can't have your medicine, can't get no education, chalk it down to a lesson learned. On and on and on and on and on. We know it ain't right. It goes on and 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 on. We all have our opinion, how we ended up.
I'm trying out a new on-demand video platform for some live streaming events, which I'm going to revisit after several years of experimental live streaming from my house in England. Music at the Mansion, they were called. And here I am in Oceana in Sweden, and this is a test video of my latest poem, which is about fiat money, about debt-based money, about the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar being the world's reserve currency. Before that it was the British pound. Up till 1971 it was those two, based on what was known as the gold standard. In 1971, after something called the Nixon shock, things changed. Elsewhere on my blog you'll find various references to these things. But this poem is about sources, regulators of sources, and the symbiosis of actors within the systems that contribute to and require the sort of healthy working of the system. Anyway, here's the poem. It's called Tides of the Dollar Moon, a poem. A planet to its star must look. The planet no less needs its moon. As the sun is the store of energy, new, the moon drives and regulates currents of the tides, time, and the nature of things. That golden orb gives all, that silvery moon regulates all. Both work together, even as the other seemingly sleeps, and yet currents of the tides, time, and the nature of things pass. On the nature of man-made things, on a standard of gold which Jennings would not be crucified upon, that cross of gold alone, hard food of Midas, no tides to complement the orb. For silver was its currency, the silvery moon to that cross's golden sun, which means of exchange fed the common man. The silver moon drives and regulates currencies of the tides, time, and the nature of things. Time passed, and man forsakes the golden orb, and its silvery moon. No credit he gave to drivers of tides, time, and the nature of things. Fiat of imperial rule enforces debts, new tides in political economy. Fiat dictates the new tides of commerce, E4s of debt above and astride the law. No silvery moon complementary to the golden orb. There are no tides by means of which the common man may be fed. Hard food of Midas alone, starvation. King Canute-like, those E4s wave, bidding the advancing tide backwards. Still they advance, tides in a tsunami of debt, tides of a dollar moon by fiat, hegemonic tides of the dollar moon.
And in this next segment, we will continue to examine the central bank's role in this entire crisis, because over the past 50 years, the central banks have become more and more powerful. So we will examine their role as well as the economic drivers behind this crisis. So we welcome panelists Catherine Austin-Fitts and Professor Richard Werner. Catherine Austin-Fitts is the president of Solari Inc., publisher of the Solari Report, and managing member of Solari Investment Advisory Services. Catherine served as managing director and member of the board of directors of the Wall Street investment bank Dillon, Read and Company, as an assistant secretary of housing and federal housing commissioner at the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development in the Bush administration, and was the president of Hamilton Securities Group. She graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, the Wharton School, and studied Mandarin Chinese at the Chinese University, Hong Kong. Our next guest is Professor Richard Werner. Professor Werner is a former investment banker and university professor in banking and finance. He holds a first-class honors degree in economics from the London School of Economics and a doctorate in economics from the University of Oxford. He is a founding chair of Local First, a community interest company establishing not-for-profit community banks. Professor Werner's book, Princes of the Yen, was #1 bestseller in Japan. In 1995, he proposed a new monetary policy he called quantitative easing, a concept that has become very popular among the central bankers. So I want to welcome both of you to the conference. Professor Werner, I will begin with you. For more than 5 years now, you have been warning that the central banks are waging war against cash and against banks as they prepare to launch their own digital currencies. So how do the regulations to control the spread of COVID-19 advance the central bank's efforts to create their own digital currency?
Well, thanks for having me. Am I on?
I think so. I can hear
Okay,
you.
because
We're on. Go ahead.
okay, excellent. Well, I can hear Taylor twice and myself once with a lag, so it is kind of hard to know who to respond to. Everyone has several appearances with a lag here on my screen.
I can hear you, Richard.
Yes, and I can see you twice.
Ah, sorry about that.
And once with a lag, which is kind of confusing. Now, can you just repeat the question?
Taylor, can you repeat the question?
Yes, absolutely. So I was saying, Professor Werner, that for more than 5 years, you have been warning that central banks are waging war against cash and against banks as they prepare to launch their own digital currencies. So how do the regulations to control the spread of COVID-19 advance the central bank's efforts to create their own digital currency?
Well, the central banks have been working towards the centralization of the monetary system that's unprecedented in world history. Until very recently, we've had the development that more banks had been created and the banking system had become more and more diversified. However, in the last 50 years, roughly, as central banks have become more and more independent from governments and more powerful, we've observed also that policies have been taken that serve to centralize the monetary system. And it seems, in a nutshell, that the policies taken since roughly March 2020 under the flag of a virus pandemic have been accelerating that agenda that had been in place for quite a while. And that is taking a number of dimensions. although the result is centralization in many parts of the economy, in the monetary system, in the payments mechanisms, and also in terms of decision making, and also the diversity of players, because clearly the policies taken have created a major setback for big parts of the economy that will find it hard to participate in the future.
Now, Catherine, welcome to the stream. I wanted to ask you, what are some of the privacy and security concerns with a digital currency operated by the central banks?
So there's several concerns, Taylor, that we have, and we have to first look at what is happening with the going direct plan, and that is very simply, we have used a health crisis as an excuse to shut down the small business and many parts of the economy. At the same time, the central bankers are printing money in a way that that the people who get that money can turn around and buy assets cheap. Think of this as disaster capitalism in a way that's unprecedented. So you shut down Main Street's economy and proceed to force everybody into the stocks and the companies you own. So we are watching a dramatic increase in inequality, because basically this is a leverage buyout by the people who I would say own the central banks and the top 1% of society. So this is engineered inequality, and we've experienced engineered inequality for quite a while. Now, what is the danger? If you combine vaccine passports, which is really a way of getting a digital ID card that can dovetail with the CBDC system, what we're talking about is a complete digital control system. It's the end of currencies as we know it on the retail level. And what it means is that if the central bankers, as Mr. Carson's explained to you, don't want you spending money more than 5 kilometers from your home, or they don't want you buying pizza, you can't do it. They have complete control of how you can transact. Now, why is this important? One of the reasons it's important is for over a century in the Western world, in the G7, we've had a balance of power between the central banks and the electorate. The electorate votes for the legislatures who determine fiscal policy, and the central banks basically determine monetary policy, and there's a balance of power. What we're looking now is a debt entrapment of the sovereign governments and the central bankers taking control of the treasuries through the back door, including through the debt, and an end of democracy and any representation by the electorates. If we use CBDCs, then the central bank can simply take taxes from our accounts. So we know that the World Economic Forum has said it's 2030, you have no assets and you'll be happy. What you have no assets means is if we have a digital control system, we can in fact take all your assets.
Professor Werner, let's speak more broadly on this issue. How would you characterize the economic policies implemented since March 2020? And this includes the restrictions and lockdowns, as well as public money injections into the economy.
Well, the policies undertaken are completely unprecedented for Western democracies, or what we thought were Western democracies. As it turns out, perhaps they aren't actually Western democracies anymore, because parliaments seem to have ceased operation for all means and purposes. Some kind of takeover seems to have taken place. For what we see is actually only paralleled when we study much more totalitarian regimes such as the Soviet Union. And it is probably fair to say that we've witnessed, under the guise of some apparently reasonable justification, some people think, the Sovietization of our societies in a process that started by restricting individual freedoms and that included shutting down entire industrial sectors, and that seems to proceed with measures and the preparation of also future measures that cannot but facilitate further fairly totalitarian control mechanisms. And that includes, of course, now the latest technologies, such as digital passports under various guises and justifications. And as we heard from the head of the BIS, the central bank, digital passports and wallets have one thing in common, that they give a lot of knowledge, a lot of power and control into the hands of those who operate those mechanisms. And these are central planners whose powers have increased in a completely unprecedented fashion in the last year since March 2020. Now, some people say that these policies are going to result in inflation and perhaps even hyperinflation. And of course, a year ago, I warned about inflation appearing. This is now visible and has come to pass. There is a concern that we're going to get hyperinflation, but at the moment, it looks like the money creation by the central banks and banking systems have been rolled back a little bit. So in my view, the hyperinflation scenario has been delayed in the short term, but of course it's still on the cards. On the other hand, we shouldn't forget that in a Sovietized economy, there can also be price controls. Certainly the indicators of prices and inflation, consumer price indices, are very much managed and controlled and engineered indices that themselves can be operate in such a way that inflation may be understated. This wouldn't be the first time in history. And so we always have to keep in mind this the Soviet model, which seems to be very, very popular in the West, for instance, in the European Union and other places.
Now, you coined the term quantitative easing. So can you please explain to the viewers what that is and how it relates to the COVID-19 response?
Quantitative easing is a policy I proposed originally in 1995 when I was in Japan. And this policy was aimed at helping post-banking crisis countries, such as at the time Japan, to emerge very quickly from a post-banking crisis type of recession and have a very strong and quick recovery. As you can tell, with Japan being in recession for over 2 decades, those policies were not actually adopted as I'd recommended. But the concept of the central bank expanding the money supply in a new way, in a quantitative way, as I'd suggested, the fundamental idea was very popular with central banks. Unfortunately, they misused and abused the concept because a central aspect of my original quantitative easing proposal was to expand bank credit creation, because banks are actually the money creator. And bank credit creation, bank lending, is what creates new purchasing power in the economy. And it's very important who gets this newly created purchasing power. That's shown in my quantity theory of disaggregated credit, also known as the general quantity theory. When bank credit creation is used for productive business investment, implementing new technologies and increasing productivity, you will get economic growth and no inflation. But if bank credit creation is used for just consumption, you get the same amount of goods and services, and you've got more consumption, more purchasing power, therefore you're going to get consumer price inflation. That one scenario is the one that traditional economics focuses on without looking at the other 2 possibilities. And the third scenario is when bank credit creation is used simply for purchasing new assets. And then, of course, you're driving up asset prices. And that creates asset inflation, which is unsustainable. That creates the essentially the seeds for the next banking crisis, because the story will only continue while banks continue to create more money to purchase even more assets, driving up asset prices further. But the moment this musical game stops, bank credit creation for asset purchases slows or stops, then asset bubbles will end and they will burst. And then you move into the reverse scenario where asset prices fall. The late coming speculators will have capital losses, and banks will start to have non-performing loans as speculators go bankrupt. Banks will then reduce lending even further, and that will reduce asset prices further until banks will simply reduce total lending, including for the economy and for productive business investment. You get a broad-based recession. So in that sort of scenario, you can very quickly solve the problem by the central bank stepping in, doing three things. Purchasing the non-performing assets from the banks at face value, moving them from the bank balance sheet to the central bank balance sheet, and secondly, expanding bank credit creation through a number of measures that the central bank can implement, and thirdly, the government can increase bank credit creation directly by stopping the issuance of government bonds and borrowing from commercial banks. These policies could have been implemented in Japan, then we wouldn't have had 20 years of recession. They could have been implemented in Europe when we had the massive recessions in Greece, in Spain. In fact, in Greece, still ongoing. You know, that's another lost decade. Could have been ended very quickly if the central banks had expanded bank credit creation. Now, what's the link to the current COVID policies? Well, they've also increased bank credit creation, but to a larger extent for unproductive purposes, for asset purchases. So the asset price bubbles continue in the stock markets, also property markets like in Germany getting red hot. And also the bank credit creation has increasingly, and this is new since March 2020, been used for consumption as government guarantees were given to individuals and companies to borrow from banks, and an increasing amount of this newly created money has found its way into consumption. While at the same time, of course, governments have shut down a number of sectors which are supply-side constraints, so that with more demand pressure and less supply due to the supply restrictions, which are artificial, imposed by governments, you cannot help but get inflation. So that explains why we've had the inflation that's presently visible, and it's now very interesting. It's going to be crucial to see what will happen next. It's a policy decision. One could end all these problems and go back to the path of sustainable growth, high growth, or through bank credit creation for productive purposes without inflation and without asset bubbles and banking crises. Or we could see more of what we've seen in the past decades, central planners essentially creating boom-bust cycles and using the recessions and downturns in order to implement further structural transformations of the system. Of course, presently and since the changes last year, 2020, it's become clear that the structural transformation continues to be a key goal, a great reset of the economy, society, even political systems, and certainly international financial arrangements seem to be very much on the mind of policymakers. So the redesign of the domestic and international financial architecture is a key topic, and perhaps we should talk a bit more about that.
Absolutely, and we will get into that and your efforts just a little bit later. But first, Catherine, I would like you to weigh on an issue that we discussed a little bit earlier. How do you characterize the government's response to what it deems a public health issue?
So the governments, Taylor, no longer have information sovereignty or financial sovereignty. So if you're the President of the United States, you're deeply dependent on the central banks to buy your treasuries and continue the financing of the operation, unless you decide to issue currency yourself, which politically you're not currently in a position to do. So you're highly dependent on the banks, and then you're highly dependent on the owners of the media and the people who are getting fantastically wealthy. If you look at the Going Direct reset as a plan to centralize control, it's phenomenally successful. So from their vantage point, it's working. The other problem you have if you're a government leader is you don't have information sovereignty. You can't get on the telephone and make a call without the intelligence agencies and a variety of other people, having the data and knowing what you're doing. So the government officials are very much in a corner politically, and they don't have the population's support to take the actions they need to get out of this trap. And in part, it's, as we heard in the last session, the populations really believe, or enough of people in the populations believe, that there really is a pandemic as a healthcare crisis instead of essentially a coup d'etat. So we're dealing with healthcare tyranny and financial tyranny, and to understand them both and to reverse them, we need to integrate our understanding of both together. But we also need more people in the population to understand that if you look at where they're going together, they're going into a central control, which is the end of democracies in the West as we know it, and a world where I would describe, if you look at where Carson's wants to take us, we will be slaves.
Hopefully we can obviously provide some solutions here, which brings me to my next question. Professor Werner, you are also involved with establishing and supporting community banks. Is this an alternative to the proposed paradigm of the central bank digital currencies?
Yes, I think essentially we have to strive to operate in the opposite direction from the central planners who want further centralization of all decision making. But really what we should do, and what is good for ordinary people, what's good for the economy, what's good for resilience, what's good for avoiding further crises, is if we have a decentralized economic structure. And that means very much based on local communities, on independent, local, both suppliers and demand groups, or communities that are resilient and self-sustainable. They can cooperate with other communities, but in many ways are locally, resilient and to some extent self-sufficient. Then they won't be affected if there are problems in other parts of the economy. And we've seen this time and again, that whenever systems become more and more centralized, as the degree of centralization increases, the susceptibility of the system to shocks increases. Because when something is very, very centralized, you just need one shock to shut down everything, because it's all under one centralized, chain of command, if you want. Whereas if you have very decentralized systems, a shock will just affect one part of the economy, but cannot affect the rest of the economy. And community banks provide a very powerful mechanism to ensure that this can be achieved, because they are essentially like little central banks. It's like, if you have a community bank in one area, then it's like having your own local central bank that not only facilitates payments and is an intermediary in a certain economic sense, but is also the creator of new purchasing power, and therefore ultimately the creator of new wealth, net new wealth creation for a community that is not based on transferring purchasing power from other parts of the economy, but is a net new addition. And then technologies, new ideas, new projects can be implemented without taking away from anywhere else, and without inflation. You will enable the implementation of such new ideas and the generation of wealth that comes from this. And again, this is shown in my quantity theory of disaggregated credit. And the mechanism to achieve this is a very, very decentralized banking system. Now, we've seen this in history, that whenever countries decide to establish hundreds or even thousands of new banks and get a very, very decentralized banking system, that's when economic growth really takes off. And we can go back to the industrial revolution in Britain, with Scotland establishing lots and lots of small community banks, and then England doing the same, English economic growth really taking off. And next we saw that Germany and the US created thousands and thousands of community banks, and economic growth has been strong for the last 200 years in these two countries for that very reason. Another good example is, of course, Japan, which also created hundreds of small banks, local banks, specialized banks, regional banks, secondary regional banks, credit unions, and so on. And then in 1978, we have the classic example. This is when Chairman Mao had essentially left the scene, and his successors have been sort of fighting who's going to take over. And in 78, it was Deng Xiaoping who rose to prominence. And he changed policies. And a key policy that he adopted was to establish literally thousands of new banks, small banks, medium-sized banks, big banks, specialized banks, regional banks, local banks, credit unions, savings banks, thousands and thousands of banks. And what did economic growth do? Well, economic growth just really took off, and we've had 4 decades of double-digit economic growth since, lifting more people out of poverty than at any other time in history. So it's been phenomenal. And so we have these eras of very decentralized banking systems based on small banks lending to small companies, because you see big banks lend to big companies, small banks lend to small companies. So if you don't have small banks, you won't get lending to SME, small and medium-sized enterprises. And they're the main employer in all economies in the world. Small firms account for 70% of employment almost everywhere. And if they don't get funding, you don't get economic growth. And if you have many, many small banks in a decentralized system, you get resilience, you get job creation in the small firm sector, and you get high economic growth. So there's many, many benefits, but it also addresses this problem that we currently experience of excessive centralization, as central planners think it's more efficient to centralize, when the truth is actually the opposite. Ultimately, it's more efficient to decentralize.
And this all ties in really well with our next segment of the evening, which focuses on decentralization. So Professor Werner, Catherine Austin Fitts, you will both be sticking with us for this next segment, but I would like to introduce 2 additional guests, including Dr. Patrick Wood and Dr. Mark Skidmore. Dr. Mark Skidmore is professor of economics at Michigan State University, where he holds the Morris Chair in State and Local Government Finance and Policy. His research covers topics in public finance, regional economics, and the economics of natural disasters. Mark created the Lighthouse Economics website and blog to share economic research and information relevant for navigating tumultuous times. Dr. Mark Skidmore, thank you for joining us today, and it is a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you, Taylor. Can you hear me?
Yes, and you may go ahead with your presentation.
Right, very good. So I just want to say thanks to Doctors for COVID Ethics for pulling all this together. One of the great things that has come out of all of this is that we're finding each other, and we're using these mechanisms to communicate ideas and across different fields. I'm an economist, as Taylor mentioned. I do work in public finance as well as economics of natural disasters, and I can say that we do have pandemics, and in the past there have been many pandemics that have within countries or epidemics that have had negative impacts on economic activity. The largest one in the last 125 years is the Spanish flu of 1918 and 19, where an estimated 8 million lives were lost. I can say in my assessment, COVID is not a pandemic by a traditional definition. We know this for the reasons that we have been discussing today, and will continue to discuss over the next day tomorrow. We know that the World Health Organization changed the definition of a pandemic to reduce removing severity and high mortality criteria. We know that inflated infection, infections from the PCR test, as was discussed today. We now know that there are numerous effective treatments available for COVID that are safe, and that it has been known that there are safe treatments for coronavirus for some time now. We also know that the definitions, at least in the United States, I think this may be true for other countries as well, the definition of a COVID fatality changed from essentially from having died from COVID to died with COVID. And so we have a difficult standard for infections. We all have a difficult standard in terms of assessing the true number of fatalities from COVID, though I think we are having real fatalities. But from what statistics we have, the survival rate is very high at about 99.7% overall. We also know that people with underlying health conditions and the elderly are far more susceptible. In some of my own work looking at aggregate fatality data across countries, I found consistent with what was discussed today is that PCR testing is associated with more infections, but not associated at all with more fatalities. Countries that have more elderly and greater obesity have more fatalities. Of the policy factors implemented across countries in different ways, lockdowns, travel restrictions, and masking had little effect on or no effect on fatalities. The only policy factor was whether or not a country made HCQ available. In our estimates with my co-author Hideki Toya, we estimate that fatalities would be about 16% less if we had just made that available. And we know, for example, in the United States, it was not made available, it was suppressed. And not that HCQ is necessarily the best treatment, but it is a treatment that was available and not used. In terms of consequences, we have to make a distinction between COVID, and the illness, and the lockdowns and restrictions. In my assessment, nearly all of the social and economic impacts are associated with the lockdowns and the restrictions. We have unnecessary lives lost from COVID due to suppression of effective treatments. We have limited access to treatments. If you're fearful and you're not going into the doctor for your regular checkup, we know that cancer, for example, is going to be more likely. And so we're going to experience more fatalities over time because people were afraid or their healthcare access was limited during this time. In the United States, the CDC estimates that suicide among teenage girls was up 51%. We saw suicide rates increase in the UK and Australia and other countries as well. Alcohol and drug related fatalities, according to the CDC, is up 30%. Tremendous loss of life. Life expectancy in the United States, for the first time since World War II, went down about 1.5 years. For minorities, it really dropped much more, about 3 years. And I would make the case, and I think others, I think the data support this, it's not COVID fatalities per se that is leading to this, but the lockdowns and the restrictions that were imposed. In the developing world, the UNICEF just recently published a report estimating that up to 40 million children over the next decade will experience wasting and malnutrition. Data show that between 10 and 18% of children experiencing wasting will die. So that's huge losses that we will anticipate. Human capital is the most, economists, I think most economists agree, physical capital is important for being productive as well as technology, but human capital is the thing that is most important. And economists and policymakers will be studying for a long time the losses in educational attainment associated with going purely online overnight. And of course, the lower income families that have fewer resources are going to be, the children of those families will be most affected. Social capital has also been affected. This is a more intangible item, but if we are afraid of one another and we don't talk to one another, and there's mistrust or a fear of being infected, it creates a friction within communities. And this is happening on a huge scale with regard to the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated. We really need to work to improve this situation so that we can continue to have those relationships that really is sort of a lubricant for a local economy. In terms of the other economic impacts, we've had erosion in faith of institutions, which I would say is probably something that needed to happen. We've had failed businesses in the United States that varies from place to place, state to state, depending on the situation. In the Bay Area, it's estimated about 40% of small businesses failed and are not expecting to return. We do have new business development as well, but at tremendous cost. As we just discussed with Professor Warner and John Titus, we've had massive monetary injections and government borrowing. That's not costless. Inflation is on the rise. Other consequences will emerge. In summary, we have some people who say most people would probably agree with the statements that I just made, but it would be attributed to the pandemic. And if that is true, it's tragic, but there's not much that we can do other than try to be cooperative. But if it's more than that, it's not just fraud, but a planned event where lockdowns and restrictions are known not to be effective, where there is a purposeful suppression of alternative treatments, where there is a deception on a massive scale in order to achieve other means. And these people are thinking of these human losses and casualties and economic losses as a cost of doing business. Then I think we probably need to call it something else if you think that. It looks more like a Holocaust. Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, people only see what they are prepared to see. And so I think the importance of this symposium is to help people see what is happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mark Seymour. I would now like to introduce our next guest, Dr. Patrick Wood. Dr. Wood is a leading and critical expert on sustainable development, green economy, Agenda 21, 2030 Agenda, and historic technocracy. He is the author of Technocracy Rising, the Trojan Horse of Global Transformation, and co-author of Trilaterals Over Washington, Volumes 1 and 2, with the late Anthony C. Sutton. Patrick remains a leading expert on the elitist Trilateral Commission, their policies and achievements in creating their self-proclaimed new international economic order, which is the essence of the sustainable development on a global scale. Wood is the publisher of Technocracy News and Trends and founder of Citizens for Free Speech. Dr. Wood, welcome to the stream and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Taylor. I really appreciate it. Great to be with you all. I'm going to try and raise the horizon just a little bit as we talk about technocracy. And there's not a lot I can add to the particulars that have already been presented. It's great stuff. I agree with Mark that just being able to kind of interact and hear these things, just fantastic, make new connections and so on. But I want to go back to, just slide back into the 1930s just briefly to point out that this is where the concept of technocracy was really crystallized. It was active before that, but it really kind of came together in the early 1930s during the heat of the Great Depression. A group of scientists and engineers at that time believed, mostly at Columbia University, believed that capitalism was dead and that it was up to them to create a brand new economic system. And they did. They called it technocracy by name. I'm not going to go through all the history on that, just to document this is a historical fact. It's there. There's plenty of information out there on it. I documented a lot of it in my books on technocracy, by the way, which are pretty much available in bookstores around the world. But over the course of years, the marketing name for technocracy has changed, and the people that have handled it have changed as well. There was no institutional support back then in the 30s for it. There is today. There's lots of big money following after this concept of technocracy. It is the only replacement economic system the world has ever known. I've I'd like to be challenged on this, but I've never found another one personally that was built from scratch. It's a resource-based economic system. It's not price-based. It's not supply and demand-based, but it's very technical and it's very specific, that it's going to be based on mostly accounted for on the use of energy instead of money. This is an otherworldly type of an economic system, and I've been tracking it for 45 years now through the auspices of globalization. But as the marketing names have changed, the ones you might be familiar with today are things like sustainable development, like green economy, like the Green New Deal. Natural capitalism is another term I've heard floated around. But the major concept is in sustainable development, which is promoted, of course, by the United Nations. And sustainable development is a resource-based economic system like technocracy. We could call it neo-technocracy today, just for the sake of distinction between the time periods. But the markers of the two systems are very similar. There's very little has changed over the last decades. And this group of actors has continued kind of below the surface, slipped into society to get into a position of control. And they have now been successful at doing that. And when I say another column of actors, I'm talking about the technocrats who believe that science is the only way to control everything in society, that all other systems of thought, philosophy, religion, et cetera, is of no repute to them. If it can't be demonstrated by science, they don't want to have anything to do with it. In the 1930s, technocracy was defined very succinctly as the science of social engineering. And it stated that it wanted to control the production and distribution of goods to the entire population, everyone in the population. They also wanted to say that there's no place for politics in technocracy. They wanted to get rid of the politicians. They wanted to get rid of the finance and financiers and so on as they knew it back then. And so it was very antithetic towards government per se. We see this working into society today where many of the big tech conglomerates now are more powerful than many countries are. And countries are now bowing to them rather than the other way around. I would point out that Christiana Figueres, who is the former head of the climate change effort at the United Nations, she was the one that organized and hosted the Paris Climate Change Agreement Convention. She said in a press conference shortly thereafter, this was documented in Europe as well as by, for instance, Forbes magazine and several places in the media. She said, this is the first time in the history of mankind that we are setting ourselves the task of intentionally, within a defined period of time, to change the economic development model that has been reigning for at least 150 years since the Industrial Revolution. This was really the first admission by the United Nations that they had a marker, they had a target on the back of free market economics and capitalism throughout the world. She mentioned they have a timeline, that they have an agenda, that they have an intention to do this. This is not just a conspiracy theory. This is what Christiana Figueres said. And since then, I have been watching very carefully to see for the signs of when this timeline would be activated. When would this all kind of come to pass? And now we see, for instance, the World Economic Forum talks about the Great Reset. They talk about building back better. The concept of building back better is based on the idea, the thought that everything has been wiped out. There's been some scorched earth policy, the house burned down or whatever, and you're going to reconstruct your economy system, your house or whatever. You're going to construct it. And as you reconstruct it, you're going to build back better. All of these people right now involved in this pandemic are the same people sponsored through and from and around the United Nations that sponsored the global warming alarmism debacle that we've seen for the last 15, 20 years. Same people, same universities, same types of computer models that are being used to scare the pants off everybody and create a system of fear. In every case, all of it is designed to drive people to one singular solution. There's never a plan B, there's only plan A, and that is sustainable development, which I very strongly believe is, we can call it neo-technocracy, it's historic technocracy on steroids. These are the people now in control. When the pandemic started, I saw that people involved on both sides of this coin. I said, this is fishy. Immediately, I knew it was fishy, that something was going on. I wrote that this was the beginning of the coup d'etat of the technocrats of the world. Their number one objective, and I just take this from literature, it's not me saying this, this is what I have seen in the literature. They are saying that, and their main target is the destruction of the economic system as we have known it for the last 150 years. That means capitalism, the monetary system, et cetera, is out. A new system is coming in. It's an otherworldly system. And the United Nations itself, just to tie it into some of our other speakers, the United Nations itself has said that the financial system that will be necessary to support sustainable development, that's technocracy, remember, is the whole area of fintech that we know that they collectively define as fintech. That's a basket of different technologies, including, financial technologies, blockchain, digital currency, the collection of data from every conceivable corner of society. And altogether, fintech is designed to be the financial system to support this new great reset, if you will, this new sustainable development economic system. It's very nefarious. I'll warn you. One of my friends, I'm going to close with this. One of my friends that recently passed, unfortunately, her name is Rosa Corey, has spoken formerly extensively in the United States and Europe as well about Agenda 21 and about sustainable development and the plans that they have orchestrated for the entire planet. And she concluded most of her talks that she gave with this statement. And I like this statement because it's just short, a few words, and it really expresses the whole nut of the thing. She says, it is the inventory and control plan for all land, all water, all minerals, all plants, all animals, all construction, all means of production, all food, all energy, all information, and all human beings in the world. That's pretty blunt. This is where this is headed right now, towards scientific dictatorship, if you will. But it's coming on like an express train. Now the second wave is taking place right now. It's all based, of course, on the pandemic idea, fear, and you do what we tell you to do and everything will be fine. But now the second wave is taking place. The economic destruction is going to be much greater than it was with the first round in in 2020. And I believe we're going to see a repeat. We're going to see more businesses going out of business. We're going to see the monetary system, the old monetary system, flying out of control. And demands will be called for this, the new area of fintech essentially to take over and to control everything from the organic level, if you will. I'm going to stop with that. I know it's a lot to say in a short period of time. And it's new to a lot of people. They just haven't heard these terms before. But I will say that the concept of technocracy is being discussed and talked about more in the world today than it ever has in the past. And that's a good thing. There's more discussion on it. There's more research going into it. There's more visibility and awareness, especially with the pandemic, that this may be exactly what's going on. I suggest that it is. So thank you for your time. I appreciate all of you guys and everything that you're bringing to the table.
And thank you, Dr. Patrick Wood. Before we do close out on this session and then move on to the next, I would like to get a comment from our two other panelists on these two presentations. I will first start with Catherine Austin Fitz. All right, I do not see Catherine. Oh, there she is.
Catherine, can you hear us? Maybe she can't hear us, I'm afraid.
Okay, we will then go to
Okay.
Catherine. Oh, there she is.
There she is.
I'm here,
Very good.
sorry.
Go ahead, Catherine.
So I thought both were excellent because both Mark and Patrick are describing the push for centralization and the extraordinary economic impact it's having. And as I listen to them, I think of two things. One is I used to have a pastor who would say, if we can face it, God can fix it. And it's a lot to hear that a global coup d'etat is underway, but it is. And I think it really helps to face it, and it brings the people together who'd like to see something else. The other thing I could say is that if there's anything I've learned by studying the economy over the last 30 years, it's that this central control is very destructive of the economy. And in fact, there is no reason on this planet for poverty. There's no reason this cannot be turned around as an economic matter. If you run an economy with this tight central control, it's hugely destructive. But instead, if you find a way to do a reset, but a reset that ends with human freedom, there's no economic reason why it cannot work. So even though facing the coup is a very difficult thing, be assured that there is no reason we can't do a very different, I'll call it the people's reset. The economic opportunity is there. Freedom is far more productive and successful.
All right, Catherine, thank you for that. And lastly, Professor Werner, any final comments on the previous two presentations?
Well, I would concur with Catherine's comments. There's no reason why we can't have a better system in terms of the possibility and the economic possibilities for us and the future of mankind. In fact, we can have very high, sustainable, non-inflationary, equitable economic growth in every country in the world, and there doesn't need to be any poverty whatsoever. Can be implemented very quickly within a number of maybe 2-3 years in almost any country. But unfortunately, the revealed preference of the decision makers has been of a very different kind, and policies are taken that do not achieve those goals that are good for the majority of the population, but instead seem to be just useful for those who want to centralize power and control. And then they use fairly weak economic arguments to justify this. So I think we need to all work on educating people so they realize that these widely used mainstream official economic arguments are false. Mostly they can be empirically disproven very quickly. In fact, the entire post-Second World War economic development paradigm centering on the IMF and the World Bank has been not just a failure, as we all know, because there is no developing country that has actually developed in any meaningful sense, moved from developing country status to developed country status in those 70 years. But actually, these policies have been designed in order to keep countries down and prevent economic development. And the only countries that have moved decisively from developing country status to developed country status are those that have done the diametrically opposed set of policies to IMF and World Bank policies, namely Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and since 1978, China. And therefore, we do need to keep in mind that we need to be optimistic. The world can be a much better world, but it clearly seems to be about power. But at the same time, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and as long as people get better informed about reality and the facts, they can see through the propaganda, and then we can start to rebuild the world, not in the reset type of rebuilding, as Mr. Globalist likes it, but in the way that it actually becomes a better society that's benefiting the majority of the population.
All right, thank you. And now I would like to take the time to welcome back all of the panelists from session 2. While we have pointed out many of the problems and the issues that we face economically and financially, I think now is a really good opportunity to start talking about solutions. So again, I would like to invite everyone back on who participated in session 2. I'm first going to start with Catherine Austin Fitz. Talk about for us the importance of positivity and the importance of also providing real solutions. I know that you have been working on one particular initiative, Cash Friday. So if you would like to speak about that and why you chose to get involved in that.
So Cash Friday came out of a wonderful meeting we had with Children's Health Defense several weeks ago. And I was talking about the danger of the vaccine passports being adopted in a way that would give tight control to central bank digital currencies. And the wonderful Mary Holland, who will be with us tomorrow, said, I was saying it's very important that we maintain a high cash balances in circulation and we don't go all digital. And Mary said, because, you know, in America, we all know about dressing down on Friday or eating fish on Friday. She said, well, why don't we have a Cash Friday? And everybody in the whole room said, that's great. So what we've asked our networks to doing, and we hope we spread it globally, on Friday, just use cash. Just use cash. Let's see if we can't dramatically increase the use of cash. We also, if you come to Solari, we have a silver and gold payment calculator, because I've said to people, look, just circulate your coins. Let's not buy into an all digital system, because it's when we go all digital that you get these kind of complete controls. So Richard talked a lot about the importance of decentralizing the banking, which is critical. If we can get the number of local banks and credit unions growing dramatically, that's going to be great for a decentralized economy. The more we can do to centralize cash, currency, equity, and economic activity locally, the more powerful transformation we can make in changing these things.
Professor Werner, I'll give you a chance to respond to that. I know you did touch on it earlier in your establishing and supporting community banks, but can you talk in a further depth as to why you chose to take on this initiative and how it relates to your other work in research?
Yes, absolutely. Well, actually, there has been a movement that started already, 150 years ago towards decentralization. And it's a movement known as the cooperative movement, which has as its fundamental pillars decentralization and placing power in the hands of local people. So the fundamental principles are self-administration, self-responsibility, and self-initiative by local people. So it's not some central planner telling people what to do. It is local people getting organized, and that's a general principle. This cooperative principle can be implemented across all sectors, clearly not just banking, although there's the largest number of banks in Europe is the cooperative banks. Germany has most of those, almost 1,000, and they've been performing exceptionally well. They're very entrepreneurial, but at the same time, they are local stakeholder banks run by local, the local community. But it's not just banking, as I said, it's across all industries. So we've seen in recent decades energy cooperatives springing up in many countries as new forms of sustainable energy or other forms of energy are being put online. Who owns this, who controls this? Well, why not the local community, and can be organized in such a way? And it can be essentially almost any service or economic activity can be designed in a cooperative fashion, whereby the local community are really the principals, and they share the responsibility, they're active, and this really then means that these businesses are accountable in a meaningful sense, because they are small scale, and you can see what they're doing. They're part of the local community, they're accountable to the local community, and then you get essentially true democracy, because people have some influence. They can shape things and their lives and their surroundings. But when things get more concentrated, all the institutions get bigger and bigger. The major disadvantage is that you can't control them. They become unaccountable. Nobody knows what is happening. And of course, then we get all the various problems, and the weaknesses of human nature start to show, whether it's corruption in a direct sense or in a very indirect sense. All these things happen when organizations get too large. So I'm very much with the principle of small is beautiful, and local communities. Now, in my work, this has essentially been one of the empirical results that have shown that such decentralized structures and cooperative structures deliver superior performance in many ways. And there's a number of reasons for that. I've already mentioned that the main employer everywhere are small firms, but small firms are only able to be viable and upgrade to latest technologies and therefore stay competitive if they get funding. But only small banks, local small banks, will be willing and able to lend to them and help them. So, and this is true also for other service providers, that essentially the more you have this decentralized structure with lots of small players locally based, the better everything is, and ultimately the more sustainable and also the more resilient things are. So it's sort of a theme across my work, which, by the way, since you asked about my work, fundamentally is empirically based. People ask me, what school of economics do you follow, whatever. Well, I don't follow any school of economics. If you want to call it a school of thought, it's simply empirical economics, or you could even say, perhaps slightly provocatively, scientific economics, because the mainstream is based on the idea that you just pose an axiom, which is something you know to be true for sure, so you never have to check whether it's true. And if you did check, you'd find out it's not true. That's an axiom. And then you add assumptions, which you know from the start are not true, but you don't care. And that's the deductive, hypothetical, axiomatic approach, which is essentially charlatanism and totally unscientific. That's mainstream economics for you. And so I've done the radical thing of saying that there's no reason why we can't have scientific research methodologies also in economics, and that's how I operate, just looking at the facts. And what I described, a decentralized, locally based, small scale, sort of locally grounded system being superior, is an empirical fact that we should be aware of, and we should take advantage of.
All right, thank you. Dr. Skidmore, I see that you have a comment or some thoughts to share, so why don't you go ahead?
Sure, I just wanted to back up Professor Warner's comments. I also have done some work on decentralization in the context of disasters, and you have this great opportunity to improve resilience, to allow communities to try different things and learn from each other. You also know that a one size doesn't fit all. And so, in the United States, we still have a lot of autonomy at the state and local levels. And what you see is a tremendous variety of policies, in response to the pandemic. And then you have an opportunity for people to vote. Right now, I think we have a challenge with our our voting mechanism, but they can certainly vote with their feet. And we're seeing that. So all of what Professor Warner said, I would just concur with and thank him for those comments.
Thank you.
And what about you, John Titus? I know that you referenced Professor Werner's work in your piece that you shared with us earlier, and the importance of decentralization and using cash. So any other comments that you have for us this evening?
You're muted, John. Unmute yourself, please.
You're muted.
Okay.
Well, I'm unmuted now. I would say, yes, I am a big fan of Professor Werner's work. He does take a scientific approach, and he doesn't follow, schools of thought in economics, thankfully, because as he says, mainstream economics is charlatanism. I would add, though, that my concern is not, I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer. And the thing that bothered me, and it has bothered me for a long time, and I alluded to it, and I just talked about it in my presentation at front, is the disappearance of the rule of law. And I first noticed this had happened in early 2013. I set up a YouTube channel in 2014 because the disappearance of the rule of law means that the law is no longer top dog, that you now have the rule of man. And that is, I don't think anybody would ever say that realistically that has been, true all along. But the disappearance in 2013 that I'm talking about is the open acknowledgement that there are people who are above the law, and institutions, namely banks, that are above the law, and that they can commit crimes, whatever they want to, and not be prosecuted for, because supposedly to do so would endanger the monetary system and endanger the financial system. And that is a very toxic, a very dangerous notion that elevates banks above ordinary people. And that was bound to have a bad outcome, and we're facing it right now. So what's the remedy for that? If you look at the founding documents of U.S., it's the Declaration of Independence and it's the U.S. Constitution. They're both premised on the rule of law. So when you have gotten rid of the rule of law, in essence, what has happened is that you have reversed the American Revolution. And the only way to get that back, there's been a coup d'etat, and that term has been used any number of times. I fully agree with that. But I agree with it really in the legal sense, that it's really the law now is really just a tool used to oppress people. And I see that very clearly. And I think a lot of people see that very clearly. And what's happened during these lockdowns, they're very draconian. They're very whimsical. They're arbitrary and capricious. They are enforced, at a whim, and they always benefit the billionaire class. And so we are now operating in an environment without the rule of law. And the way to get that back, unfortunately, the only way to get that back, if you read history, is a revolution, the counter-revolution. I mean, and Alexander Del Mar, who for my money was probably the greatest monetary historian of all time, said, the American Revolution really wasn't about Lexington and Concord. It was really about the refusal of American colonists to use the Bank of England's monetary system, because it was a debt-based system and it was very oppressive. And the revolution really was the colonists' use of their own money. So I think solutions like using cash on Fridays is a major step in the right direction, but we need to make a lot more. I think the more time you spend trying to operate within the metes and bounds of the current system, you're playing into the hands of the criminals who are running that system now. And we need to start thinking about solutions that are outside of the system, like using our own, currencies and creating our own currencies. That happened thousands of times over and over again during the Great Depression, local communities using their own currencies. And so, like Professor Werner suggests, it's going to have to be small community-based institutions that they're going to be the laboring ore and what's to come. But I think that we're in a very serious trap right now, and there really aren't too many solutions to get out, unfortunately. But solutions like Cash Friday, like I say, that's a step in the right direction. And that's really what I have to comment there.
Okay, thank you, John, for that insight. Dr. Patrick Wood, I could see you shaking your head. So are there any final comments that you have or any more statements that you want to follow up on regarding your own presentation? And you're muted.
We do need a counter-revolution, in a sense, to try and turn the tide on this globalist onslaught it's in every country. It's not just America, it's not just France, not just Germany, it's everywhere. That's part of the problem. People in every country need to take action these days and try and do things to push back. One of the things that I've been greatly concerned about as one who is a constitutionalist, I respect and revere the U.S. Constitution as a system of government, is that free speech and the concept, which is embedded in the concept of the First Amendment, free speech is absolutely essential, not only just for human progress, kind of in a larger sense, but in any particular group of people. Free speech is what produces ideas, and it produces relationships, it produces wisdom. We have lost this. This is under attack all over the planet, and especially in America. We see it with massive censorship of doctors and medical professionals. Anybody's got anything commonsensical to say, they're shut down before they can even say it. Media's been taken over. This is a marker of a revolution taking place. Revolutionaries always go after the media first. They take over radio, TV, newspapers, and this has happened in the Bolshevik Revolution all the way up through Rhodesia, Mozambique, the sub-Saharan African revolutions. It's always the media first. They're going after media right now and the shutting down communication. If we lose the ability to communicate, like we're communicating right now, this is a blessing for sure for a lot of people, that we have the ability to speak our mind openly without fear of shame, rebuttal, censorship, whatever. But let me tell you, the windows are narrowing in every possible venue. And so we have been just kind of actively, and I won't say desperately, but I could say it, okay, we're desperately trying to get people back to where they start open their mouth again with constructive communication in their own communities to restore their belief systems and their ideas into their local communities again. That's why I started Citizens for Free Speech 4 years ago now. And we've, especially since the pandemic hit, our membership now has absolutely exploded. We're well over 30,000 nationwide members in the United States. And people are understanding now more and more, hey, it's up to me. Don't look at the government. Don't look at the president, Congress, anybody else. It's up to us individually now to take a role in restoring and turning this thing around. And it must start at the local level, in my opinion. And I think a lot of the comments we've heard already kind of reinforce that. But in the end of it, it's all based on our ability to communicate with each other. If we lose that ability to communicate, we're really cooked. So this is something we want to hang on to.
All right, thank you. And I want to thank all of you for participating on this segment. And I want to thank everyone who participated in this entire conference today. As we do close out, I would like to welcome back Dr. Michael Palmer and Catherine Austin Fitts. Dr. Palmer, as we conclude today, are there any final thoughts or messages that you want to share with the viewers right now, and also provide them with some understanding as to what is to take place tomorrow? Because this is just the first day of the conference. It will continue tomorrow, and we will get into discussions regarding vaccines, the media, and psychology.
Did you talk to anybody in particular? Sorry.
Michael, you're on. You're live.
Okay, good. Right. I was admitted only after Taylor actually had addressed me.
Okay.
Okay, so I will just simply start with the wrap up. So as Sucharit pointed out, right, this pandemic is false, and it is basically all about instilling fear, right? Everybody is driven into fear. The populace has been driven into a panic, okay? And in order to promote this, an artificial virus was created, but it appears to have underperformed. I believe indeed that the virus was intended to be more lethal than it was, but the criminals who run this show didn't miss a beat and just simply compensated for the lack of actual lethality with lots of propaganda. And in order to promote general fear and in order to maintain the appearance of an actual pandemic, they created fraudulent tests widely deployed on people that should never have been tested because they were not sick in the first place, and other tricks in order to further goose these numbers. Okay, now in order also further to promulgate this fraud, right, the entire medical literature has been hijacked. We saw examples of papers that were scientifically sound, but which were initially even published and then retracted, even so there was no factual basis for any such retraction. And we see that disasters such as the apparently up to 55,000 fatalities after vaccination that have occurred in the United States alone, according to the latest numbers announced by Americans frontline doctors, these will never make it into the official literature. They are simply kept out of the official record altogether, which means that the medical scientific literature is no more credible than the Pravda of your, than the People's Daily, right? You can really forget about the entire medical literature. Physicians who were not willing to go along with this, who questioned the official narratives, they tried to raise the alarm about the toxicity of vaccinations and so on. They were intimidated, bullied, sanctioned, and if need be, terminated. If they refuse to go along, they are terminated, right? So we have these toxic vaccinations, right? The signal, the record of damage is now really indisputable, and I think we will talk about this more tomorrow. And at the same time, the efficacy is really not proven at all. In fact, it is disproven. These vaccines are proven to be ineffective and toxic, and they are still being forced onto the population. So this can really be nothing else but just an act of enforced, a demanded and enforced act of submission. Right? People are requested to get this vaccination in order to show that they have given up. This is either they show that they have either bought into the narrative, that they have been completely gaslighted, or otherwise that they have given up. Either way, they submit. This is a test of submission. And with that, I would actually like to hand it over to those people who have told us more about the political and economical motives behind this medical fraud. Who is going to go next with that?
Thank you, Dr. Palmer. That is correct. Today, we did hear from several leading experts in economics and finance, describing to us exactly how these lockdowns will impact our economy and finances in the future, as well as how this indicates that there is perhaps an agenda or perhaps a need or desire to get our system or transform our system to a digital currency. And I would like to hand it over to Catherine Austin Fitts to wrap this up for us. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We will be returning tomorrow. We will be discussing vaccine psychology as well as the media's role in all of this. So Catherine, I'll hand it to you.
So I just have to say, one of the reasons I love participating in Doctors for COVID Ethics is once a week, I get to hear Dr. Palmer's wrap up. And as you can see, it's brilliant and succinct. So what I will say is that health policy is being manipulated to implement a global change in control of the governance and the management system in a way that I think most of us participating in this discussion don't want to see. And that means it comes down to every one of us, both in how we manage our health and how we interact with the health system, and in our pocketbook and our money, how we interact with the financial system. Everything we can do to change and in our day-to-day lives start to send it in a different direction, because the secret that we've been discussing here is there's no reason it has to go this way. And in fact, I used to have a friend who ran for governor of Tennessee, and he said, you know, you think a snowflake is very weak and powerless until you realize enough of them can get together and shut down New York City. So what I would say to you is that if each one of us in our daily lives, in our time, with our attention, with our money, if we shift our money away from supporting the kinds of things that we're watching now, which are so frightening and disturbing, and start to shift our money into people of integrity and institutions of integrity. I had one doctor the other day say, you know, I'm ready to build a whole new world. I said, let's get going. So I think if enough of us make a change, there's a lot that can be done. And I would really recommend everybody check into the Doctors for COVID Ethics website, because you'll get some good sort of scientific information and ideas on what that group is doing. So with that, I want to thank everyone for a wonderful first day, and please join us tomorrow. We have a lot more. We're going to start off, Terrell, I don't know if you remember this, with the propaganda matrix. We'll be talking about propaganda.
Absolutely, which has been obviously a big part of this in establishing and instilling fear in the public. So we will get into that with many other media figures who have been covering this entire crisis since day one. So I look forward to speaking with them about that, as well as discussing the COVID-19 vaccines. And hopefully this will be a useful tool of information that you could share with your friends and your family and those that you care about. So again, I want to thank everybody who participated today. Those who are watching right now, do not forget that we will be returning tomorrow afternoon at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You won't want to miss that. And thank you guys for watching.
Thanks.
That there's a magic money tree, that there's a magic money tree, that there's a magic money tree, extra payment you don't want to add to, no tax you don't want to rise. But the fact is we have to concentrate our resources on the people who need it most, and we have to stop thinking, as you do, that there's a magic money tree, 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 that there's a magic money tree.
Money grows on Merkle trees, a creature of cryptography. The computer has to say yes, so banks can issue debt, you see. Central banks prune Merkle trees, adjusting the rate of usury. Government borrowing and private debt add up to the money that you get. Economists argue about theories 3, commodity, chartless, or credit theory. In truth, all theories of the Merkle tree are based upon a tautology, that's MMT. The simple rhyme that you can sing is money now is the nothing you get for something before you get anything. Let's all join in.
That there's a magic money tree. You're not credible. Jeremy, I that there's a magic money tree. You're not credible. Jeremy, I that there's a magic money tree. That there's a magic money tree. You're not credible. Jeremy, that there's a magic money tree. Jeremy,